Have you ever finished a film, only to realize that your understanding of the entire story had changed? Not because the story lied to you, but because it carefully controlled what you were allowed to know. Stories don't manipulate us through magic. They manipulate us through narrative. By deciding whose perspective we follow, what information is revealed, what remains hidden, and when those hidden truths finally emerge. In narratology, these techniques are known as focalization, restricted narration, narrative gaps, and retrospective reinterpretation. My Dearest Assassin employs all of them with remarkable precision. Today, we'll examine how the narrative gradually constructs and then dismantles our assumptions. The narrative begins with a deliberate gap. The opening sequence immediately establishes an action narrative: violence, escape, pursuit, conflict. Like most viewers, we instinctively search for familiar narrative roles. Who is the hero? Who is the villain? Who deserves our sympathy? Surprisingly, the narrative refuses to answer. Instead, it creates what narratologists call narrative gaps. We don't know who these armed people are, why this Vietnamese child is being hunted, why her family had to die, what larger conflict exists beyond what we see. Nor do we know why Lan herself is so important. The film withholds this information deliberately, not because the writer forgot to explain it, but because curiosity becomes the engine that drives the narrative forward. Restricted narration. One of the film's most interesting techniques is its use of restricted narration. The audience only receives fragments of information. At first, our understanding of events is largely shaped by the mysterious organization. They determine what enters the narrative. More importantly, they determine what remains hidden. Later, the story shifts. The Foster family's perspective gradually becomes dominant. Without noticing it, our emotional alignment changes with it. This shift illustrates another narratological concept: focalization. Focalization simply means whose perspective shapes the audience's experience. As the focalizer changes, our interpretation changes as well. The same events acquire completely different meanings. Dramatic irony. As the children grow older, another narrative strategy emerges. The adults know more than the children, but the audience also possesses knowledge unavailable to them. We have already witnessed violence. We recognize the danger surrounding this family. The children do not. This creates dramatic irony. The emotional tension no longer comes from asking, "What will happen?" Instead, it comes from asking, "When will they finally understand what we already suspect?" Knowledge itself becomes suspense. Characterization through silence. One of the film's greatest strengths lies in its method of characterization. Rather than relying on lengthy dialogue, the narrative constructs its characters through silence. Lan rarely verbalizes her trauma. Her silence functions as characterization. The audience gradually understands that her anger originates not in the present, but in a wound that has never healed. Pran represents another form of silence. He doesn't openly challenge his father's authority, yet his actions consistently contradict that authority. The narrative defines him through behavior rather than speech. Then there is M. Although sacrifice becomes a recurring motif throughout the family, M's sacrifice carries greater emotional weight, not because it is larger, but because the narrative carefully establishes the emotional bond that motivates it. Characterization emerges through action, not explanation. Retrospective reinterpretation. Perhaps the film's most sophisticated technique occurs much later. The revelation concerning Lan's blood fundamentally changes the meaning of earlier scenes. Narratologists describe this process as retrospective reinterpretation. A later revelation forces the audience to reinterpret everything they previously believed. Scenes that once appeared affectionate suddenly become morally ambiguous. Acts that seemed motivated by unconditional love can now be understood as necessity. The emotional center of the narrative shifts. Lan is no longer simply a daughter. She risks becoming a resource, a body valued primarily for what it can provide. The narrative does not merely surprise us, it rewrites our memory of the story itself. Narrative gaps that remain open. Not every narrative gap is eventually closed. Some remain unresolved. For example, why does Lan direct her revenge toward a single assassin? rather than the organization responsible for the destruction of her family. The narrative offers no fully satisfying answer. Another unresolved gap concerns the romance. The relationship between Pran and Lan develops too quickly. The audience is asked to accept their emotional intimacy, without witnessing its gradual evolution. Compared with the careful construction of Trauma, the romance receives relatively little narrative space. This weakens its emotional credibility. What makes My Dearest Assassin compelling is not merely its action. It is the way the narrative controls knowledge. Who knows? Who doesn't? Who becomes our focalizer? Which questions remain unanswered? Which revelations arrive too late? The story demonstrates an important truth. Narratives rarely manipulate us by lying. They manipulate us by deciding when we are allowed to know the truth. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson this film offers. The most dangerous assassin isn't always a character. Sometimes it's the narrative itself, because before it changes the characters, it changes the audience. This has been The Narrative Mind, where we don't simply ask, what happened? We ask, how did the story make us believe it? If you enjoy exploring the mechanics of storytelling, narratology, and cinematic meaning, subscribe and join me in uncovering the hidden architecture behind the stories we love.